Hello, everybody, and welcome to Blogging Heads. That music you're hearing in the background is because we have a very special Blogging Heads Rock Block weekend. No, I am joined with Peter Scoblic, the executive editor of The New Republic, and also the author of Us versus Them. And this is, of course, the contemplative sounds of Pink Floyd's Us and Them. So I'll be us, and you be them. Welcome to Blogging Heads, Peter. How are you doing?
Thank you, Eli. I'm doing well.
Good. This is just so smooth. I kind of want to let it go. I don't know if you can hear it on the other line there.
I'm enjoying it very much.
Okay, very good. Well, anyway, let's get started. Why don't you kind of start off and give us... We're not going to spend the entire time talking about the book, but it is an important book. Recently, Samantha Power... I guess former advisor of the Obama campaign and probably a very likely senior advisor if Obama wins the presidency in the White House, reviewed this book. And why don't you sort of sketch out the thesis about, because it's really an attack on 20th century conservatism and how their views on national security.
Well, yeah, I mean, I started out to write the book to explain basically to explain the Bush administration's foreign policy, and in particular its approach to nuclear policy, nuclear strategy, and non-proliferation in terms of its approach to Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and other countries that present proliferation concerns. And, you know, especially with regard to Iraq, kind of the conventional wisdom over the last 7 or so years has been that the Bush administration was kind of taken over by neoconservatism, which is an ideology that I think few Americans were really familiar with before the Bush administration, and may not even be that familiar with now in terms of what it actually stands for. And I didn't, I guess, find neoconservatism an entirely convincing explanation for Bush foreign policy, and I felt a lot of the criticism of Bush foreign policy was really descriptive and not explanatory, that sort of a lot of the pejoratives that were tossed around in terms of, unilateralist or militarist or imperialist, maybe, were sort of, certainly nasty words and maybe helped us understand parts of the administration, but didn't really get to its core. And so I tried to do that, to really trace back the roots of the Bush administration's foreign policy, and I found them a little bit earlier than what a lot of people were talking about in the 1950s, which is when the modern conservative movement really took root, led by William F. Buckley Jr. and National Review magazine, and then sort of expressing itself through Barry Goldwater and ultimately through Ronald Reagan, and the way that those folks defined conservatism vis-a-vis foreign policy, and the way that I define it in the book is an understanding of U.S. foreign policy as really being a battle against evil, a battle of good versus evil, of us versus them, where we are the good guys. And during the Cold War, obviously the Soviets and communists more generally were the bad guys, and that kind of basic dualism, that Manichaean view of the world had a number of ramifications. One was that you couldn't coexist with your enemy because in moral terms, good never wanted to coexist with evil. Instead, you wanted to defeat evil. And in Cold War strategy terms, that meant that conservatives rejected the bipartisan foreign policy of containment because it implied coexistence over a long term with the Soviet Union. It also led them to reject negotiations, to reject what they called summitry, and that also led them to reject specifically arms control, which was a form of diplomacy that assumed particular importance after the advent of nuclear weapons. And so what I do in the book is look at how that affected U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War and show that it really led to a number of very dangerous situations, and certainly situations or positions that don't make a tremendous amount of sense in retrospect. And then, show how those, provide or serve as a precursor for this administration and help us to understand what's been going on over the last 7.5 years.
Well, I have a lot of questions, and first of all, disagreed with a lot of the book, but it really is a very beautifully written, Peter.
Thank you.
And there's a lot in there that that I think that average reader wouldn't know. For example, I didn't know that Barry Goldwater had opposed the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think that there's a lot there, even though I disagreed with it. But let me ask you a question. Let me start off with I have a bunch of questions, but let's start off with Goldwater and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you think that maybe some of this might be where you sit is where you stand? When you're out of power, when you're out of the executive branch, it's very easy to kind of criticize these sorts of negotiations. When you're in power, and Reagan, when he eventually was in power in '86, does go to Reykjavik, though he doesn't do everything that the arms control crowd wants him to do. Makes a different set of decisions. Whereas, maybe we could, we'll get into Obama versus McCain later. But Obama says a lot of things now that maybe he wouldn't necessarily do when he was in the White House. Do you think some of it might be that conservatives start off the Cold War very much out of power, seeing themselves as a revolutionary movement themselves, as you point out? And then as they finally get into power, they're forced to confront and make decisions that, while in the end I think Reagan had a very distinctive policy from his predecessors, both Republican and Democrat, he did not end up being the kind of purist that, you would expect if you were a reader of commentary or the position papers of the Committee on the Present Danger.
I think that's true, but to me what that suggests is that some conservatives find once they're in power is that the ideas they've been advocating, for years or sometimes for decades really don't serve the U.S. national interest or are not, they're not able to implement them in the same ways. And so that seems a fairly damning indictment of an ideology that's been laid out, very clearly over many decades and by many different people. It's worth noting as well that, although there are conservatives, like Ronald Reagan, who once they took office did sort of switch positions. And in fact, we seem to be seeing some of that now, after 7 years with the Bush administration, that there have always been conservatives who held the ideological line, both outside the administration and even within the administration. You see that, now with Dick Cheney, who, for example, has really not been a supporter of the Bush administration's sort of easing of its position toward North Korea, and you see it with someone like John Bolton, who's left the administration and really is, a true and ideologically consistent conservative, really apoplectic about the things that the Bush administration has done vis-a-vis, North Korea and Iran. So I think you're right that, conservatives do sometimes change once they get into office. But to me, that says, not that there hasn't been such a thing as conservatism or that it's not important, but that, a lot of conservatives have a kind of unfortunate reality check once they're given responsibility.
Well, you mentioned the Bush administration, and I do want to get to that, or this current Bush administration, but let's go back to the 70s, hence the Pink Floyd music. Are you there, Peter?
I'm here, yes.
Oh, okay, good. You talk about Team B, and we know because of declassification that a lot of particulars of the Team B assessment were not correct. But I think that you gloss over. I mean, you get into it a little bit in your book about mirror imaging. But I think that one of the main arguments that was correct from the Team B crowd that was actually put into place from Reagan was the idea that the Soviets would not temper their defense spending based on the needs of their infrastructure or their domestic population. That they would do everything to kind of keep parity, if not outpace, the U.S. in an arms race. And to a certain degree, I think conservatives have a good point when they say that the early Reagan administration may have sped up, which would be, I think that, first of all, let me take a step back. The only one who I think got the Soviet Union was a paper tiger or was collapsing was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I like to claim at least as a neoconservative, though certainly an eccentric neoconservative who didn't toe any particular line. But, as you remember, I'm sure in 1980 he was sort of beginning to look at these questions very differently and said that the Soviets really couldn't keep up, their sort of planned economies the way they were. And after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, he felt very vindicated and wrote a whole book about this. But most people, left and right, the détente crowd as well as the conservatives and the neoconservatives, believed the Soviets were going to be around. And I think that Reagan, his idea was that ultimately you could defeat the Soviet Union short of an apocalyptic nuclear war. And I think that in the end, while there wasn't certainly a military defeat of the Soviet Union, I think that the notion that he tried to sort of challenge it, and you got into it a little bit in your chapter on Reagan, was, generally right. And I think that you give it a little too short shrift. I wouldn't say that Reagan caused the collapse of the Soviet Union, but certainly some of the decisions that he made, pressuring them in Nicaragua and Afghanistan, certainly rejecting early on some of the arms control agreements, may have and probably did create the moment where Gorbachev could come to power, because the old guard had proven that none of their ideas were working. You don't think that there's any credence to that at all?
Okay. Well, you're talking about a lot of different things there. So let me try to stop me if I skip over something, because I think the Reagan administration is an administration that we're going to be talking about for a long time. There are a lot of different views, a lot going on there. I think that you're right that Reagan probably was one of the few people in any point along the ideological spectrum in the United States who thought that the Soviet Union might be defeated in the short or even medium term. That said, I don't think that the policies that he pursued during the first part of his administration were either wildly different from those of his predecessors in many ways, or to the extent that they were different, didn't accelerate the fall of the Soviet Union, but rather worked in sort of a perverse direction, heightening the tension between the two, making it more difficult for someone like Gorbachev to come to power, engage in a rapprochement with the United States, and ultimately end the Cold War on a peaceful note. And as I note in the book, a lot of the things that he did during his first term in office actually brought us to the precipice of possibly nuclear conflict in what's a relatively little known and exercise or incident called the Able Archer exercise in November of 1983.
The Soviets believed that was preparation for an offensive first strike.
The Soviets, exactly. This was a NATO exercise conducted. It's a relatively, I don't know if you want to call it pro forma exercise, but NATO conducted regular military exercises, obviously. But in November 1983, they conducted one that was a little bit more realistic than the ones that they had conducted in the past. And in addition, the exercise came at the end of a year that was really bad for U.S.-Soviet tensions. Reagan had given his Evil Empire speech. He had given the speech calling for the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Tensions had really been ratcheted up after the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner's jet, provoking a very strong reaction from not only President Reagan but George Shultz and the United States writ large. We were also on the cusp of deploying Pershing missiles to Western Europe, and Yuri Andropov was in charge of the Soviet Union at the time, a fairly paranoid figure who believed that the United States might actually be contemplating a first strike. And when this NATO exercise went forward, he thought that sort of the time might have actually come, and it was a very dangerous moment. But you mentioned other things as well. You talk about Reagan's support to the rebels in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. I do think, obviously, Afghanistan the Soviet troubles there played a large role in convincing the Soviet Union that they couldn't maintain the degree of control outside their borders that perhaps they had. But that wasn't necessarily a conservative foreign policy either. Aid to the Mujahideen had begun under Carter, as I say in the book.
The aid to the Mujahideen under Carter was like giving them World War II era machine guns. I mean, it was Reagan's decision to give them the Stingers that could actually shoot down the Hind helicopters that made a difference, that made them a lethal force, and actually bled them in Afghanistan, making it very difficult and raising the cost of their revolutionary expansionism.
But I'm trying to do two things here. I mean, one is to disaggregate the the role that conservative ideology played. And I think it's difficult to say that Reagan's decision to aid the Mujahideen may have been correct, may have put increasing pressure on the Soviet Union, but it's difficult to classify it as a conservative decision when it was pursued not only by Jimmy Carter but also by the Chinese communists. And that's generally conservatives didn't consider themselves on the same side as the forces in Beijing.
But support for the Mujahideen was part of a wider doctrine that said that we were going to support freedom fighters either through lethal aid or non-lethal aid that were seeking their emancipation from the grip of communism. And that was, by the way, seen as very provocative at the time by the Strobe Talbots and the Jonathan Shells. And part of the argument in the 80s of that Reagan was a madman who believed in the apocalypse and would bring us to a nuclear war was that he kept challenging the Soviets and breaking the old rules of détente. I mean, and surely you would agree that, when he gives the evil empire speech, when he says, Gorbachev, tear down this wall, the reaction from your New York Times set that, was why is Reagan, provoking the Soviet Union? We're going to have a nuclear war, which was the sort of de facto answer at the time. And it turns out that a lot of these things probably led to at least expedite. Now, I agree with a lot of historians now that the Soviet Union itself was inherently unstable, and that therefore it was probably inevitable that they were going to collapse. They couldn't keep it up in this huge, enormous, centrally planned economy. They couldn't keep up, it's like the old Sharansky, what is that Sharansky view, that eventually the armed guard's arm gets tired, right? Because you have to keep a gun to the citizenry. But certainly Reagan's sort of insight and moral clarity on this, I think, saved the world in some ways for, however many years of the extension of the Soviet Union.
Well, once again, I think you're conflating a couple of different things. I don't think that it was moral clarity that led Reagan to support the Mujahideen. I mean, once again, was it moral clarity that led the Chinese to support the Mujahideen or Jimmy Carter? I mean, to the extent that Reagan was supporting, them more, you can say, okay, he, upped the ante in Afghanistan, and that's fine. But I don't think it was a function of moral clarity. I don't think it was a function of conservatism necessarily. The second thing is, the Soviet Union did not collapse because of pressure that was put on it in Nicaragua or even Afghanistan. The Soviet Union did not we did not gradually roll back communism from the periphery to the point where, the Kremlin sort of crumbled. Communism collapsed at the center. The Soviet Union collapsed at the center. And that was a function of, not simply the Reagan administration, but of a defunct ideology that had been, running the country for 70 plus years. And it was to the extent that we put pressure on the Soviet Union, it was put on the Soviet Union by numerous successive administrations who had, much like Ronald Reagan, exerted pressure at the periphery. This was the heart of the containment doctrine espoused by George Kennan, who was very much, not a conservative and became a villain of conservatives over subsequent decades. So I think that, while, I don't seek to argue in the book that Reagan's decision to aid the Mujahideen was wrong, and I don't suggest that Reagan had no impact on bringing the Cold War to a close. I think it's simplistic to suggest that it was aid to Nicaragua or Afghanistan that played a pivotal role. And to the extent that Reagan did confront the Soviet Union in terms that are often lumped under this rubric of moral clarity, I do think they were dangerous. I do think that, to the extent that he perceived the Cold War as a battle between good and evil, and to the extent that his policies toward the Soviets, particularly his nuclear policies, flowed from that sort of starting assumption, they were very dangerous and came very close to bringing us toward nuclear war. And that includes sort of this, initial refusal to negotiate with the Soviets over, our nuclear arsenals. It includes his decision to not only ratchet up the U.S. nuclear arsenal, but also attempt to pursue civil defenses and missile defenses, all of which suggested a nuclear war fighting strategy in contrast to sort of the the status quo, the mutual assured destruction, which had kind of been accepted as a fact of life beginning in the Johnson administration. You can think of sort of, mutual assured destruction as kind of nuclear coexistence, and conservatives, just as they rejected containment as coexistence, rejected MAD as nuclear coexistence, and really sought nuclear superiority over the Soviets. To the extent that Reagan did that, I think that was enormously dangerous. And it wasn't until Gorbachev came into power, Reagan, to an extent recognized just how dangerous his behavior had been, and, became willing to sit down with the Soviets, that kind of tensions calmed.
A couple things. First of all, I think the Soviet Union.
Well, Eli, let me just interject.
Now, whether or not it's smart foreign policy not to negotiate with them, but I think that it's a system that was a slave system, and I think that we have Reagan is the one who is revered in Eastern Europe and seen in many ways as a liberating president. And how many? Well,
let me just interject for 1 second, Eli, because I do want to. This is an important point, and I tried to make it in the book, but it's certainly possible that there's confusion. And the book never, and I never suggest that the Soviet Union was not evil, or that the United States is not or was not good. The point that I'm making is that seeing the Cold War in those terms and sort of deriving policy from that initial assumption ends up being counterproductive, and which I think is a very different thing.
Okay, now let's and then make it okay. First of all, I would argue that no one single decision from Reagan. You could argue that Reagan's pressure on Western European countries not to build the pipeline to the Soviet Union may have had a role in it. There were a series of policies that all stemmed out of the NSPD decision directive, which I'm sure you're going to remember the number of, and I'm not.
75.
35. That's the one, right? that aimed to, on a diplomatic front, in terms of a political warfare front, in terms of an intelligence front. Casey had the map in his office at the CIA where he had blue pushpins and red pushpins, and also from an arms control perspective. Now, I want to make sort of 2 points. One is, I think it is incredibly damaging to a revolutionary ideology to see for themselves the pushback or rollback of a state that they believe had sort of entered the inevitable phase of history. And for the communists to lose, if they were to ever lose a Cuba or a Nicaragua, or for that matter, an Afghanistan, or as they finally lost, sort of watching, East Germany and Eastern Europe, for the Soviets to leave, that I think was a profound psychological blow to of an ideology and a system that believed that they were on the right side of history, that their way of organizing societies was in fact inevitable. For them to suffer a setback like that is very different than for the U.S. to lose a client in Iran in 1979. That's one, and two. You mentioned the INF Treaty and the role of Richard Perle, someone who I very much admire. And Perle says 0 for 0. He comes up with a zero option. You say that was a trick or that was an effort to try to really scuttle the negotiations. But then later, Reagan, with Perle there, agrees to the zero option because we deployed those Pershing missiles. So wouldn't you argue that, Perle in the long run, why don't you should write a thank you letter to Richard Perle. Thanks Richard Perle for getting us this awesome deal where we finally got the Soviets to get all those missiles out of Eastern Europe, right?
No, I don't think I'm going to be writing any thank you letters to Richard Perle in the near future. Well, go ahead. I think that to take the second point first, the Perle 0 for 0 option in the early 80s was an attempt to scuttle negotiations. And
because we didn't have any of our missiles yet in Western Europe, and the Soviets already had missiles in Eastern Europe.
That's right. So in essence, what it was,
right.
In essence, it was a request for the Soviets to unilaterally disarm in Europe, which is would it have been a good thing for the United States and for NATO? Sure. It was just not something that the Soviets were ever going to accept, just as we would not have accepted, that kind of an offer were the situation reversed. So, what Reagan ended up doing was, deploying nuclear weapons to Western Europe. And after Gorbachev came to power...
Over of protesting Germans.
Yes, exactly. That's absolutely true. And protesting Americans as well. The Pershings, and there were also nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missiles deployed. Right. This was really this decision came at the height of what was an nuclear movement both in the United States and in Western Europe, and it was seen as very provocative. And it's important to recognize that it was provocative. As we talked about before, this was during 1983, and specifically during the fall of 1983, which is when we came to this kind of crisis moment with the Soviet Union.
Archer.
The Able Archer exercise. So, anti-nuclear protesters were correct that it was provocative. Now, in sort of 1986-87, once Gorbachev has come to power, Reagan and he have established a rapport. They end up agreeing to get rid of all intermediate-range missiles, and that includes the Soviet SS-20s, and it includes the Pershings. And so you end up getting this sort of 0 for 0. Of course, it's not the same deal as it was in the early 80s when Perle was proposing it, because now we're giving up something as well. And Perle leaves the administration at this point, actually. And
wasn't he? But he was with Reagan in Reykjavik. He was at his side in Reykjavik.
He was in Reykjavik. That's right. Reykjavik is one of these fascinating moments in history where Gorbachev and, it's the only moment in history where Reagan and Gorbachev actually talk about getting rid of all nuclear weapons, and Perle, along with not only many neocons and conservatives, but also just sort of realists and pragmatists, were horrified by this. Perle ends up leaving the administration sort of around the time that the INF deal is being inked. I'm not sure whether it was in protest or not, but really the administration was going in a different direction from what he supported at that time. Going back to your first point, if I'm remembering it right, I think that sure, seeing a defeat for communism in say Nicaragua, an ideological defeat elsewhere in the world is a blow toward communism as an ideology. But this is where you see a little bit of a different understanding, or a significant difference in understanding between how realist pragmatists like, say, George Kennan viewed the Cold War and the way in which conservatives viewed the Cold War. The Cold War was, to an extent, an ideological conflict, obviously. But, Kennan understood it primarily as a conflict between nation-states vying for power. And to that extent, it matters less to the United States that there are sort of these ideological, almost psychological blows to communism than it is to see the Soviet Union itself on its heels and to collapse. Even if, let's say, communism is rolled back in Eastern Europe, our allies come to power in Nicaragua, Central America is peaceful, there is still, this direct threat to the United States from the Soviet Union itself. That is really, who the conflict was with, and that is where the existential threat to the United States sprang from. And so while, did the Soviet Union suffer an ideological blow? Sure. But I'm not sure that was essential to, saving the United States from, let's say, nuclear holocaust. And in terms of ending the Cold War, as I said before, what was really crucial was that the Soviet Union itself collapsed. It collapsed at the center. It was not, rolled back beginning at the periphery and then ultimately winding up in Moscow.
Well, on this we disagree, though, because communism is you're right, the Soviet Union is this huge, enormous country and empire itself, but it also has a sphere of influence, and it's constantly trying to expand throughout the Cold War. There was a threat at one point. We look back on it, and we obviously never saw this come to pass, but there were armed communists in Italy, for example, as we know, right, who were committed to a kind of revolutionary ideology. And I think that part of what propelled Reagan's foreign policy, and you admit this in the book, is that détente did not end up actually really curbing a lot of the Soviet the Soviet expansionist activities, as we know from not only their invasion of Afghanistan, but from their mucking around in our hemisphere. And and I think that Reagan, sort of by fighting back on those peripheries, was also striking a blow to the center.
But how does that...
And while I agree with you that like there's two different things, like there's the issue of our ICBMs and their ICBMs, and it's good to have. I think conservatives were wrong. It was good to have a line of communication to prevent a nuclear war resulting from some sort of misunderstanding. So those things are good, and I think that when the book is strongest in its critique of conservatives from the early movements, when you're right, like opposing the NPT, which at least at a certain point was something that was fairly good for the United States, was a dumb idea. But I think the book is less persuasive when it gets to Reagan, and now I don't think that a lot of the same lessons would apply necessarily now to Bush, but we should talk about Bush because we have some time to do that.
Yeah, let me just make one final point on that, and it's a question we can move on if you want, which is Reagan's confrontation of communism at the periphery. I don't think anybody disagrees that was valuable to some extent, but I do think it's important, and for the purposes of the book, which is trying to sort of identify an ideological lineage not only for the Reagan administration but for the Bush administration, to answer, well, how is that really different from, let's say, Truman, Kennan, Acheson, who were, not considered conservatives and were really, lambasted by conservatives.
Not that different. No. Agreed. So, no, Truman, Acheson, those
then
are
once
fine.
again, my purpose is not to say that, Reagan was a bad guy, but to say that conservatism as an ideology was not productive, and it was in fact counterproductive and often dangerous. And it strikes me that just a lot of the positive things that you're citing about the Reagan presidency could be said about presidencies that were by no definition conservative, including the Truman presidency.
Well, see, that's the whole thing. I'm a neoconservative, so my beef with the Democrats is not Truman and even Kennedy. My beef is when the hippie Marxists took over the party and you had McGovern and so forth. So, that's my problem is the new Democrats post-Vietnam. It's not really the Democrats. I think Democrats were hawks, and most of the neoconservatives sort of revere Scoop Jackson, who was a Democrat. So if you're gonna, I agree. Yeah, it wasn't that different from Truman. And there were always Democrats. We were talking about the Mujahideen. Charlie Wilson was a Democrat, of course, who probably is more responsible for the money for those Stinger missiles that had such a difference in Afghanistan than anybody else. So my problem was never with Democratic Party per se. It's sort of the fight over the soul of the Democratic Party, which I think begins in really 72, or what you could say 68 with the Yippies. What are they? The Yippies, the Chicago 6 and the 7 and Abby Hoffman and their LSD and everything like that. Yeah, anyway, those people.
I don't spend a lot of time on them in the book, but I hear you.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, I'm being unnecessarily provocative. Anyway, so let's fast forward to George W. Bush, and it's interesting because I actually covered a lot of these stories, but you got really into the nuts and bolts. So in some respects, as I said, you should read the book, even if you're closer to my view on it than Peter's view, just to sort of, because I think it's probably one of the most articulate kind of broader critiques I've read. But give me your kind of nut graph on Iran, North Korea, or the axis of evil. Give me your nut graph on that.
Well, as I said when we started talking, the thing that I didn't understand about the Bush administration was really its approach to the axis of evil. I guess the first thing that confused me was why prioritize Iraq. After 9/11, I think everybody agreed that we had to be more aggressive in combating terrorism, and I personally felt that what that really meant at root was combating nuclear terrorism, because despite the enormous horror of 9/11, the fact was that we were able to survive 9/11. And what concerned me was that we wouldn't be able to survive a nuclear 9/11. Not in the sense that the entire country would collapse, but that, really, if you think about the changes that have occurred in the country since 9/11, you magnify those by, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 fold, and you start to wonder.
That's one of the best parts of the book was that those 4 pages where you describe what happens in the event of a nuclear terrorist attack. It's one of the clearest and sobering sort of warnings, and it's really like, because if you read Graham Allison and other people, I mean, you can get it, but actually I think that your book is the best if you want like a very quick 4 pages. This is why this is awful, and we probably can't survive it. I would recommend whatever that chapter that starts off with that. I forget the chapter it was, but it was really
chapter 6. It's given a few people nightmares, for better or for worse. But
okay, we're back. Peter, please continue.
Okay. So, I mean, as I said when we first started talking, the book was an attempt to understand some of the confusing policies of the administration, and really the first one, or the chief question for me was, if we were trying to stop a nuclear 9/11 from taking place, if that was really the priority post 9/11, then why go after Iraq? And obviously at the time, many people thought that Saddam Hussein might be reconstituting a nuclear weapons program. But in the fall of 2002, during the run-up to the Iraq War, the thing is that we knew that both North Korea and Iran actually had more advanced nuclear programs, and there was far less uncertainty about those programs. We believe that North Korea had a highly enriched uranium program that we, had just confronted them about. And when we confronted them, they pulled out of the agreed framework, which was a 1994 accord that had stopped their production of plutonium. And so in late 2002, early 2003, the North Koreans were producing plutonium again. We also knew that Iran had a program to enrich uranium that was proceeding, and when IAEA officials visited Iran in early 2003, they were sort of shocked to find that there was this pilot centrifuge cascade program up and running, which would ultimately enable the Iranians to make fissile material for nuclear weapons. But not only did we continue going after Iraq, we refused to negotiate with Iran and North Korea. And, going back to this kind of, Manichaean good versus evil worldview that I talked about, vis-a-vis the conservatives during the Cold War, it had led conservatives during the Cold War to reject containment as a policy because it implied or required coexistence with evil. And it also led them to reject negotiation because, you don't make deals with the devil, essentially. And I think, while there's certainly no monocausal explanation for the Iraq War, I think that this framework helps explain, why Iraq and not Iran or North Korea. Iraq was really a case study in the not necessarily the dangers of containment, because I think Iraq was relatively well contained, but in the sort of moral lack of satisfaction of containment. We had Saddam Hussein in a box, but he, was continually trying to poke holes in it. Whether it was firing on, U.S. and British aircraft as they patrolled the no-fly zone, or illegally smuggling oil out of the country. The containment of Iraq was sort of a reminder to conservatives that we were forced to coexist with evil. And unlike in Iran and North Korea, which present really significant military challenges, Iraq was a case where we actually could roll back evil. It was, to put it bluntly, sort of the most invadable member of the axis of evil, and I think that helped lead to a prioritization over Iran and North Korea, and it also helps explain why the Bush administration simply refused for a long time to negotiate with either of those other two countries. A refusal that, among other things, allowed their nuclear programs to continue apace.
All right, well, if I may respond to some of that. First of all, according to Sandy Berger, Madeleine Albright, and even President Clinton, Iraq was not contained. By the end of the Clinton administration, you had a number of states deliberately violating, starting incidentally with Hugo Chavez, but ending with a lot of our European allies even, the UN sort of trade sanctions on Iraq, and that there was this fear that Iraq was not contained, that the sanctions regime had indeed collapsed, and it was also very corrupted, and that Saddam had found a way out of it, as we know from the final Dulfer report and even the testimony of David Kaye, which is that, back to something, you sort of say that conservatives talk about cheating in these international arrangements. Saddam had shown that he had no intention of complying, and I think you note in the piece that, the fact that the inspectors were let back in, and as a result, there was a successful sort of show of force that allowed Saddam to bring the inspectors back in. But given the fact that the inspectors had already been in Iraq, that it had already been a cat and mouse game, that Saddam was not allowing, his scientists in the nuclear program to leave with their families safe, which was a condition of the final resolution, and so forth and so on, I'm less persuaded. Even Hans Blix never could come around to saying yes or no as to whether or not Saddam was in compliance or had been concealing these kinds of programs. And secondly, I would say that North Korea and Iran in many ways are sort of outgrowths of how the international system and the international treaties that are aimed to protect the civilized world and the entire world, as it were, from terrorism and nuclear proliferation had failed us. The IAEA did not give us advanced warning of the Natanz enrichment. That was, in fact, an admission of an activity that had gone back at least 15 years in 2003. And the same is true with regards to the Joint Framework Agreement and the acknowledgement of Yongbyon. Now, that's not to say that it's better than nothing. I mean, I think that it's true that if you have inspectors on the ground, as we do right now in Iran, as we do right now, I guess, in North Korea, that is better than not having inspectors on the ground. So I am by no means sort of taking the line that, the perfect should be the enemy of the good. But at the same time, I think that conservatives looked around and they said, you know what, this system is not working. We were not able to, the IAEA was not able to do a dent against A.Q. Khan's nuclear black market. It wasn't able to give us any kind of fair warning with regards to testing on Pakistan and India. And while maybe there's a possibility for reforming the NPT down the road, or maybe there's a possibility for coming up with better enforcement mechanisms and so forth, right now the system was broken. And I think that, largely the argument for Iraq was not Saddam is evil, so therefore we should invade it. It was that Saddam was a gathering threat, and we couldn't wait around to be surprised yet again that Saddam had developed the weapons that we suspected he was developing.
Well, just out of there are a number of things there that I can respond to, but just out of curiosity, if the concern really was that he was a nuclear threat, why focus on, if your concern is that there is a nuclear threat, why focus on the less serious one in Iraq rather than the more serious ones in North Korea or Iran?
Well, listen, at the time, administration people sort of said that from an international legal perspective, because there were, 16 UN Security Council resolutions, and they were all a condition of the 91 ceasefire, that there was far more of an international legal justification for ultimately taking action against Iraq, whereas other diplomatic approaches, and by the way, diplomatic approaches, as you point out in the book, were tried once these sorts of things were sort of found out. The fact that North Korea proved that it could be sort of in the NPT arrangement until the very moment that they decided to be out of the NPT arrangement was one of the reasons why Bolton and others did not favor a protracted negotiation with the Iranians, fearing that they would do the same sort of thing, which is that they would sort of negotiate in bad faith until the moment that they could test a nuclear device. But that said, I think that in the case of Iraq, you already had the prior administration sort of admitting the sanctions regime was collapsing. There was, despite the revisionism of the net left and a lot of Democrats right now, there was a consensus among international intelligence agencies as well as in the U.S. intelligence community that Saddam was developing these weapons. And while it's true that Mohammed al-Baradei said, wait a second, we don't think he really has much of a nuclear program, as I said before, Baradei did not help us out too much on North Korea or, for that matter, Iran. Now, maybe you could say the IAEA wasn't in a position to do that, but what's the point of having an IAEA if it can't tell us when states that are ostensibly part of those agreements are about to cheat or about to give us some sort of warning?
You got a lot of things going on there again. I mean, I think that the IAEA is obviously in a much better position to ascertain compliance with a UN resolution or the NPT or whatever if it has essentially free run of the country. I mean, one of the limitations of the NPT and of the IAEA is in a lot of situations it is dependent on the target country's compliance with inspections, and the IAEA and the NPT member states have tried to rectify that over the last few years with this thing called the additional protocol, which allows for more intrusive inspections. Nevertheless, I mean the Iraq case in late 2002 when inspectors were readmitted is a far different case than something like Pakistan, which is not a member of the NPT and is not required to allow IAEA inspections at all for that matter. The second point is that, and another thing that a larger point about the book is that while the book is clearly an indictment of conservatism and its approach to foreign policy, it's not. The converse does not necessarily hold true, which is to say that just because I disagree with the Bush administration's approach to, let's say, Iraq, does not mean that I believe the Clinton administration had the correct approach. And, to the extent that the Clinton administration was saying, Saddam Hussein is not contained, well, I mean, he may not have been contained economically, but militarily he was contained. And, the Clinton administration did not decide to invade the country, because Saddam Hussein was smuggling oil, and I would hope that that's not why the Bush administration invaded either. And just to come back,
it wasn't
let me just make
I'm
one
saying
more
that those,
point.
those all related, though, to
I want to come back to an earlier point you made, which just struck me as a little, it strikes me as a little bit preposterous, I guess, to suggest that the Bush administration invaded Iraq because it had international legal justification, which doesn't really seem to have been one of the priorities of the administration, and obviously it ended up invading without Security Council approval. And I think that, I don't know, suggesting that it prioritized Iraq over North Korea and Iran because it didn't have international legal justification, seems to me probably a misreading of what's happened, but also, if that were true, strikes me as incredibly irresponsible. While I, obviously support, various international legal frameworks, particularly when they come to non-proliferation, I think that if there were a threat to the United States, more serious threat in, let's say, Iran or North Korea, dealing with a different and far smaller threat first, simply because, a UN resolution says it's okay, that doesn't seem to me either very conservative or very smart.
Well, okay, listen, primarily the reason why they invaded Iraq is because they did not want to allow threats to gather, or rather, in the words of Condoleezza Rice, they didn't want to find the smoking gun in the form of doubt, which is to say that they recognized the limitations, if you will, of the international agreements that had already been set up and already violated by Saddam Hussein. So, because there had already been a process with Iraq that involved inspections, kicking out inspectors, resolutions, sanctioning it, and so forth. As you remember, one of the big arguments at the time, there were two. We're not going to allow threats. Secondly, was if the international law was to mean anything, then what do you do with a country like Iraq that, is now on its 17th UN Security Council resolution? That is, and these are serious, warnings and so forth. And then for the international community not to do anything, there was a belief that, in some ways, I wrote this at the time, and I think that Colin Powell made this argument, but also Bush made this argument, that in some ways they were, I guess, violating international law in order to save it. And that was, at the time, a major part of it. And you can say they are not motivated in many ways by sort of an adherence or a strict sort of understanding of international law. And it's certainly true that there were conservatives in the Bush administration that saw the kind of traditional conservative argument that the UN and UN treaties and various things were an infringement on American sovereignty and therefore were not desirable, kind of in the Jesse Helms mode. But there were also, there was also another view, which was that the international system itself, right now, was not capable, as it is right now, to kind of continue to sort of drift, and you continue to see a situation after 9/11 where states that were sponsors of terrorism, as well as in violation of sort of nuclear non-proliferation treaties and so forth, and not nuclear, but a violation of the proliferator states that were of serious concern like that you could not allow them to continue to sort of flaunt the demands of the UN and with no consequences, and that I still think we don't have a good system for coming up with consequences to states that decide to sort of disobey and and flaunt international laws. We're seeing with Iran right now. I don't think, by the way, that the approach of increasing economic sanctions that affect the Iranian population is a smart way to change the behavior of a regime that I don't think cares about the welfare of its people.
I mean,
as I think we saw in Iraq. We saw in Iraq a system where we were trying to affect the behavior of Saddam Hussein by ultimately imposing sanctions, whether originally through the embargo or later through oil for food, that affected his population. Saddam, in fact, benefited from the impoverishment and malnutrition of his population, and I think that we still are in a kind of, we don't really have a good tool in the toolbox for dealing with regimes that just simply don't care about being in compliance with international law, which is sort of gets back to maybe the sort of Soviet point, which is that the argument about cheating is that it's much harder for a transparent and open society to cheat on nuclear arms agreements because there's opposition parties, a free press. The government has an obligation to sort of, account for lots of information for its citizenry, than for closed systems and totalitarian systems or authoritarian systems like the Soviet Union or, for that matter, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it does create a kind of disparity when you're talking about trying to resolve these through negotiations and arms control agreements.
I mean, I think there's a lot there that you're saying that I would agree with. I mean, I think that certainly, violators of international regimes need to be confronted. At the same time, you got to remember the purpose of these international regimes. I mean, at least for me, the purpose of, let's say, the non-proliferation regime is not to simply establish, international comity so that, we can all, get along. It's to serve the national security interests of the United States. That is ultimately what it comes down to. And when you're confronting, three different states, each of which, has or may have a nuclear program, it seems to me that pragmatism and the demands of national security argue that you go after the most dangerous threat first. And while Iraq, certainly needed to be confronted, inspectors had not been in the country for 4 years. It was not, fulfilling its obligations. And as I say, I was, thrilled that when we confronted them, we were able to get inspectors back in the country and get, all of this new data about what was happening that, we on the ground that we hadn't had for 4 years. It strikes me as a mystery why any U.S. administration, but particularly one that, when it referred to international law or international norms in sort of scare quotes, which Condi Rice did in her famous foreign affairs essay during the 2000 campaign, why they would prioritize the preservation of international law or an international regime over a greater threat to the security of the United States, particularly a nuclear threat coming from North Korea or Iran. And, I just think that the point here is that is something of a mystery, and I don't think that the narrative to date had answered that.
Iran or North Korea, Peter. No one was going to invade Iran or North Korea, right? Like, we weren't going to do that,
right? And that's in essence what I'm saying is that Iraq here, it was the most invadable member of the axis of evil, and that rollback, as opposed to, let's say, containment or negotiation or, even a long drawn-out process working through these international regimes was really the way that the Bush administration preferred to deal with threats. And I think that preference can be traced to this Manichaean worldview that at least in modern conservatism.
How does a long drawn-out process help stop North Korea? I mean, we had a long drawn-out process in the Joint Framework Agreement, which the North Koreans secretly violated, admitted they violated. Now, granted, you could argue, there have been some people who say,
it kept their plutonium program under wraps for 8 years. That is a valuable thing. And, over the last, 6 years it's been.
But it wasn't valuable enough, though, because they had other programs as well, which they said didn't apply under the Joint Framework, which is sort of, for years. Remember in the 90s, you were, I guess, editor of Arms Control Today,
right.
And conservatives who were saying, I think the North Koreans are cheating. And there was no evidence of that, or at least that the Wendy Sherman and the Clinton administration were not coming forward with, any evidence they may or may not have had. When the North Korean ambassador tells John Bolton, hey, we have this other program, just FYI, it strikes me that that's evidence that whatever agreement we thought we had with the North Koreans, they proved to be, they proved to sort of not really care about living within the realm of international law. Hence, there.
But none of this is about. Yeah, no, but none of this is about, once again, this isn't about, the moral character of the North Koreans or whether we trust the North Koreans. I honestly have yet to meet an American diplomat, on the left, right, or center who trusts the North Koreans as right. An opponent at the negotiating table. What the point was, it's a pragmatic point. We kept, X kilograms of plutonium or potential plutonium in these 8,000 spent fuel rods that had been produced by the reactor at Yongbyon under wraps. When they were no longer under wraps, they were reprocessed into plutonium, giving the North Koreans the potential to build more nuclear bombs. And when the North Koreans exploded a nuclear device in late 2006, that was a plutonium weapon. So I think that, one can argue that, yes, the North Koreans, cheated on the agreed framework. Does that mean that it was silly to negotiate with the North Koreans? No. It kept them from producing more plutonium. And that's, plutonium that was kept out of either a potential North Korean nuclear arsenal or, kept out of the hands of whoever it might be proliferated to. And I think that is extraordinarily valuable. The agreed framework was not a sign that the North Koreans are, a warm and fuzzy
I wasn't arguing that. I was arguing that the agreed framework we thought had basically stilled North Korea's pursuit of a nuclear weapon.
I think that there was... I guess I would disagree with that a little bit. I mean, from my understanding, and a lot of this is admittedly still classified, but that the late Clinton administration was keeping an eye on signs that there was a highly enriched uranium program, that was conveyed to the Bush administration when they came into office, and that, they kept an eye on it as well, but it wasn't until late 2002 that they felt they had enough evidence to confront the North Koreans. I think that, one of the arguments that's used against arms control is that if we sign an agreement with an opponent, that all of a sudden we're going to think everything is hunky-dory and we're going to, let down our guard, and that is going to be dangerous. I don't think that the Clinton administration let down its guard on the agreed framework. The Bush administration, didn't let down its guard. I don't think we should ever let down our guard, even after we sign an agreement. But, I still think the thing was valuable.
All right. Well, we are going to have to wrap this up. This was a good dialogue. There's a lot more, things we could discuss. We might want to do it again, Peter.
I would love to.
I'm going to take us out to the smooth sounds of the dark side of the moon, you hippie Marxist Democrats, you. Here's your theme song, Us and Them. No, I'm just joking. Hold on, it's not coming up. Oh, damn. That's my iTunes for you. All right. Wow, it'd be nice if you had Us and Them.
Not on hand, sorry.
No. I thought it was so cool to... Anyway. Here we are, see? Okay, so thank you very much, Peter Scoblic.
Thank you very much.
Another episode of Blogging Heads. Good dialogue. Okay.
Take care.
Okay, thanks. Bye.